Thank you, President Davis. To my fellow Kiwanians and guests, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Sam Martin as a speaker for our meeting today. Sam is the Executive Director for the Bronze Valley Foundation, a 501c3 based in Birmingham, Alabama, and the President and Publisher of the Birmingham Times. I first met Sam while I was working in Montgomery in 2011. I remember thinking after reading his impressive bio, like many of you have read his bio, okay, so let me get this straight. You are coming from Jersey, the Boston Globe. You're coming to my hometown, Montgomery, to run the Montgomery Advertiser. This is going to be interesting. But Sam proved to be a quick study, and his ability to develop relationships and his expertise running a paper, along with his passion for journalism, was just what the Montgomery Advertiser needed. Through our decades-long friendship, I've learned a lot from Sam. We've bonded over the years over our love for our fraternity, Kappa Alpha Psi, sound business ideas and strategy, as well as good cigars. Sam has always got an impressive recommendation for a good cigar. He often speaks about pairing passion along with sound business principles to ensure there are profits also to support your passion. His most recent work with the Birmingham Times is a great example of that. Sam's work in repositioning and reformatting the weekly into a vibrant, enterprise-focused paper was recognized by the National Newspaper Publisher Association's General Excellence Award, and his team helped usher in the Times' online presence along with the Birmingham Times app. The Times distribution has increased to over 225 locations, and home delivery subscriptions have increased 10%. Sam received his BA in Communications from Central State University and is a graduate of the Northwestern University's Newspaper Management AEE program. Sam is married to his Central State University college sweetheart, Kathy, and they have two daughters, Erin and Jordan. Please join me in providing a big Kiwanis welcome to our speaker today, Sam Martin.
I want to thank Foster for that wonderful introduction. It's interesting that when you get old, when somebody tells you about your children, you realize that your children are grown, and when they were younger and it was so important to say, and he has two children, you kind of figure you got adults. I wish I had some grandchildren that I could tell you about, but they're not cooperating, no matter how hard we try. Foster is right. There were some interesting times running the Montgomery Advertiser a few years ago. And it was a little bit of a culture shock coming from Boston. I'm a Midwesterner by upbringing from Ohio, but spent quite a bit of time on the East Coast between New Jersey, Delaware, New Jersey, and Massachusetts. And I'm happy to be here to talk to you today. Now, let me start out by telling you that if you're expecting a high-tech presentation today, I'm not your guy. I got an iPad here to help keep me on track with my notes. But when I talked to Jeffrey and he asked me would I be willing to come talk to you, I said, well, what exactly do you want me to talk about? He said, well, look, it's Black History Month and you're in the newspaper business, and why don't we just have a conversation? Why don't you talk a little bit about newspapers, talk a little bit about the impact that newspapers have had in the Black community, and we really like to hear about the Birmingham Times. So I'm going to try to knit those three things together in a sort of a coherent discussion to kind of give you some idea or try to meet the expectations that Jeff gave me. So I don't know if I think it was in my bio. I think I titled this thing "The Fourth Estate, the Black Press, and the Evolution of the Birmingham Times." And if you saw that, you're probably thinking, okay, this will be a good one. So here's what the reason I wanted to start out talking about the Fourth Estate. So media, specifically newspapers, have been a really important part of this grand experiment that we call a democracy. It was stated that the idea that a good democracy would exist would be through a functional democratic government needed to produce outcomes such as the power of the people to choose leaders, the power of the people to exercise royal rights, and to offer legitimate and responsive accountability to government. And to achieve that, you need an informed populace. And from the founding of this country, a free press has played an important role in achieving those goals. The fact that the First Amendment speaks separately of the freedom of speech and the freedom of the press is no constitutional accident, but an acknowledgement of the critical role that free speech and the press plays in American society. The press has been considered so important in this experiment that it has been labeled the fourth estate, which describes the journalist's role in representing the interests of the people. The fourth estate in Europe is a European term. And in Europe, it refers to the clergy, nobility, and common people, and as the first three estates. And the fourth estate is the press. But here in the United States, historically, the fourth estate has been considered the fourth branch of government. And it refers to the watchdog role that the press and its importance to a functioning democracy. The idea is that the fourth estate could act as a counterpower to the three powers of the state. This counterpower would report, verify, question various matters of governance, both publicly and commercial, that the other powers exercise, and it should be nonpartisan, neutral, unbiased, and untouched by the other states. James Madison, our fourth president, said, "To the press alone, checkered as it is with its abuses, the world is indebted for all the triumphs which have been gained by reason and humanity over error and oppression." Checkered as it is by all of its abuses. In spite of that, I believe in the press, specifically newspapers, just like I believe in democracy with all of its flaws. I've worked for some great newspapers and witnessed firsthand them turn a light onto injustices in their communities. I worked at the Boston Globe, and during the time I was there was a big story that won a Pulitzer Prize about the Catholic Church. They shed a lot of light on injustices and things that were going on in the Catholic Church. But great things that have been done by newspapers have not only been done in grand style like that at Boston Globe. I worked at other newspapers where there have been just as important work being done in those communities that doesn't have the same kind of cachet, but has the same kind of impact in those communities. So in spite of the 21st century, 24-hour cable news net channels and online news sites, I have not been jaded by carnival barkers dressed up as journalists. And I believe that the press will continue to do so, until I see an effective alternative to ensure the counterbalance of power of the other three estates. I believe that an unchecked government is dangerous. And as newspapers disappear, I fear that local governments are being left unchecked, leaving people vulnerable in small towns and cities all across this country with little or no information. And that concerns me because I think that does not make for a sound democracy. So how does the Black press fit into this experiment we call democracy? And why was it ever needed? The press, as checkered as it is in its abuses. The African-American community learned very early that it could not rely on traditional newspapers to inform communities or tell our stories. We understood the power of the pen and knew that an informed community was a strong community. Hence, the Black press was born. Starting in the 19th century, the Black press became a critical component of the Black experience, providing news and information that helped inform the Black community. The Black press actually came to life in 1827, when a group of African-American New Yorkers, no longer able to tolerate the denigration of the Black population on the pages of mainstream media, pooled their resources and founded Freedmen's Journal. The editors, John Rushworm and Samuel Cornish proclaimed in their first issue that Black Americans would now have a means by which to plead our own cause. We would no longer have to depend on white abolitionists to speak to them, for them in the white press. I apologize, I should put this in silent. Okay, where was that? Okay. The Freedman Journal, it ceased publication after 2 years, but it broke new ground as both an experiment in Black entrepreneurship and as an inaugural instrument of public expression by African Americans where none existed before. 1827 also marked the beginning of an era in which African Americans would use the printed word as a means for political protest when other outlets for public expression were available, or when few other outlets for public expression were available. Before the Civil War, newspapers in the North became a vital force in the anti-slavery movement. After the war, Black newspapers in both the North and the South helped to forge cohesive communities of former enslaved African Americans. And after Reconstruction, when racial violence targeted African Americans, the Black press once again took up the mantle of political activism. African American communities embraced these newspapers as a sign of freedom and a source of information about Black people and Black communities. The Black press of the Reconstruction era dedicated itself to building communities of free Black men and women in both the North and South. The American Freedman was a New York-based newspaper that served as an outlet to inspire African Americans to use the Reconstruction period as a time for social and political advancement. This paper did so by publishing articles that referenced African American mobilization during Reconstruction that had not only local, but had gained global support. During the antebellum South, other African American newspapers were started, such as the North Star, founded in 1847 by Frederick Douglass. Most African American publications, like Freedman's Journal, were published in the North and then distributed mostly covertly to the rest of the country. As African Americans moved into urban centers around the country, virtually every large city with a significant African American population had newspapers directed towards that population. And many of those newspapers gained audiences outside the African American community. From the beginnings, African American newspapers struggled to keep circulation going due to the low rates of literacy. And many freed African Americans at that time had low incomes. And while they could not necessarily afford to buy a paper, they shared paper. So therefore, the circulation numbers never really got to where they needed them to be. There are a few notable newspapers I thought it was worth mentioning that were founded back in those days. Freedman's Journal, which I've talked about, founded in 1827, the first African American newspaper founded in this country. The North Star, founded in 1847 by Frederick Douglass, was another one that I thought made sense mention. And then the Ohio Tribune, which was later renamed the American Catholic Tribune, was founded in 1885. It was actually thought to be the first national newspaper run by a Black person. In the 1860s, newspapers started to form out in California as Black folks began to move out there with the gold rush. And while these newspapers came, with these newspapers came brave and pioneering journalists, such as Samuel Cornish, an American minister, abolitionist, publisher, and journalist. And he was a founder of Freedman's Journal, Freedom's Journal. Mary Ann Shadd Cary, she was an American Canadian, and she was the first woman to publish a newspaper in North America and in Canada. Ida B. Wells, which is a person that a lot of people has heard about, was prominent during the late 19th century and early 20th century. She was a journalist, an educator, a civil rights leader, and a co-founder of the NAACP. Alice Dunnigan was an African-American journalist, civil rights activist, and author. And she was the first female, African-American female that was actually given White House credentials. Alice Dunbar Nelson was an American poet, and she was actually born here in the South, of the first generation of African Americans born after slavery. In 1919, following the mainstream media newspapers, the Chicago-based African Negro Press was formed. And it was a national news agency with correspondents and stringers all over the country where Black populations existed to create news and content to be shared with African American populations around the country. While many African American newspapers were founded in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, by the year 2000, there were just 200 left. Currently, there are just over 100 African American newspapers in this country which are considered part of the original Black press. In the 21st century, newspapers like mainstream papers have shut down, merged, or shrunk in response to the dominance of technology and the internet in providing free news and information and expensive advertising. However, contrary to the newspaper dynasties of the Hearst, the Scripps, the Binghams from Kentucky, Sulzbergers in New York, or even the Grahams in Washington, few, if any, African-American publishers ever gained any great wealth. In fact, they spent most of their time toiling just to keep the paper put out and make sure that the communities that they were serving had an opportunity to get the news and information that was important. Here in Alabama, there have been over 125 African-American publications dating back to 1865, when the Nationalist was founded in Mobile. It was the first African-American newspaper owned and operated by Americans in the state. And I should note that the paper was edited by two white men who here in the South at the time, I guess, would be called a carpetbagger, which I guess, I'm from Ohio, I probably am a carpetbagger. The Republican was the second paper that was found, well, the Republican that was founded in 1870, also in Mobile, was believed to be the first newspaper, African-American newspaper, to be actually edited by African-Americans in the state. There have been 29 Black newspapers published here in Birmingham dating back to 1876. I'm going to note a couple of them. The Birmingham World, it was founded in 1930 by W.A. Scott, and has probably been the most consequential newspaper, African-American newspaper in the state. It published bi-weekly or weekly for 66 years before ceasing publication in 1996. But it still remains Birmingham's longest published Black newspaper. Emory Jackson is its longtime editor and is noted as an important part of the civil rights movement here in Birmingham and across the state. The Birmingham Times, founded by Dr. Jesse Lewis, began publishing in 1964, is the only remaining member of the nation's Black newspaper press left here in Birmingham. Other than the Times, there are only two other African-American newspapers here in the state of Alabama. The Greene County Democrat in Utah, and Speaking Out News in Huntsville. The Mobile Beacon, founded in 1963, actually stopped publication in 2019. Now, I had a part here where I was gonna say, you wouldn't know from my bio, but we kind of talked a little bit about it. I've kind of jumped around a little bit. I've been in 6 states and you include Birmingham, 9 cities. And when I came to Alabama in 2010, frankly, I didn't realize that I was the first African-American publisher of a mainstream newspaper in the state of Alabama. There were a few people who called and reminded me that during the time that I got there. But when I left the Advertiser a few years ago, I was really determined to start a new chapter. What I didn't realize that my new chapter was my old chapter with a twist. And was my old chapter with a twist. I'd always understood the value of the Black press. And frankly, you know, when I worked in Wilmington, Delaware, and Cincinnati, Ohio, and Dayton, Ohio, and in Boston, I always had a relationship with the Black publishers in those communities. Worked with them, collaborated with them, and tried to help them find ways to increase their resources. And what I didn't realize was that time that I was spending with them was preparing me for my next chapter. When the foundation I ran at the time was called the Foundation for Progress in Journalism, and now we're called the Bronze Valley Foundation, decided to buy the Times from Dr. Lewis. We did it as with the thought of preserving an important part of Birmingham's history. The Times is, as I mentioned, is owned by a nonprofit, which is also a very forward-thinking process as we think about the Fourth Estate. There was an opinion piece written a couple of years ago in the Seattle Times that talked about, it was titled Nonprofit Newspapers Might Be One Way to Sustainability. But that's not the only place that they're talking about this discussion of nonprofit newspapers, nonprofit journalism. There is a fear that if we don't continue to find a way to fund journalism, that we will not be better off because of it. And as we lose these local outlets, as we lose local newspapers that are out there digging, doing investigative reporting, and uncovering injustices that are happening in our communities, we will not be better because of that. But I would think that with the Birmingham Times being a nonprofit, we're positioned well as that discussion continues to evolve over the next few years. When we bought the Times from Dr. Lewis, he was turning 90, and he had never missed a weekly publication in over 50 years, which goes back to the point I made earlier about the dedication that Black publishers had. It wasn't about making money, it was about informing the community. However, he was 90, and the prospect of a paper surviving him was unlikely. And we couldn't let that happen. It's been too important to the fabric of this city. Since this is Black History Month, I wanted to take a minute to share a little bit about our founder, Dr. Jesse Lewis. I've heard people talk about Dr. Lewis and talk about he's a pioneer. He's 97 years old and goes to work every day and is running a real estate empire from right over on West 3rd Street. It's amazing that a man can be 97 years old and you have a conversation with him and he's adding up numbers in his head and getting to them before you do. But he is quite a story. He was the first Black person to work and represent Coca-Cola Company. And he was the first Black person to produce an ad for Coca-Cola Company that actually had an African-American person in that ad. He was the first African-American to serve on George Wallace's cabinet. And he's one of the few people in the Black community that saw newspapers as an instrument of economic independence. In an interview, he once said, "I'm a firm believer that economics is the key to success that will determine how well you are accepted in the community." He went on to say, "I may be wrong, but that was my concentration. Right or wrong, his focus on economics is the reason the Birmingham Times is still in business nearly 60 years later." And when I mentioned Emory O. Jackson and the Birmingham World earlier, I did so because I think Dr. Lewis would want me to. I've talked to him on a number of occasions. He said to me, Emory O. Jackson and the Birmingham World made a greater contribution to the civil rights movement here in Birmingham than I did. And I want them to be acknowledged for that. So I thought it was worth mentioning that to you, just so you know that while the Birmingham Times is still here, there were those who came before us that charted a path. When I took over the Times in 2016, the main goal for us was to reposition the Times and chart a new path. Newspapers in the 21st century are relative dinosaurs, as you know. But unlike dinosaurs, I do not believe we are destined for extinction. But we do have to evolve. We need to change how people view us. And the key component for us in the repositioning was changing our content and our format. Our transition to a tabloid format, smaller designed what we call a centerpiece story, has accomplished exactly what we hoped it would accomplish. It has allowed loyal readers to rediscover the Birmingham Times. And when we did that, we changed our brand to BT, which has allowed new readers to discover us for the first time. If you're familiar with what we call the reimagined Birmingham Times, you know that we are different from the first 50 years. When we took over, I told readers that we would be unpredictable, that we would cover and what we covered, that they should expect diverse topics, they should expect diverse faces, and while we will continue to cover the African-American community from an African-American perspective, I wanted to make sure that everybody in Birmingham felt welcome to read the Times. We're unapologetic about the fact that we cover this community from an African-American perspective, but we're not just a newspaper for Black people. Being a weekly, it was important for us to introduce content that was evergreen and not likely found in other publications or online. A format change in our content strategy to feature a weekly centerpiece story has been critical. With the content strategy, we are forced to build an edition around a story, which forces us to look for stories that aren't being told in other places. Stories like the one back in January about the diversity in Norwood, or the Odessa Wolfick story back in December. Last year alone, we told stories about the homeless, a mother and daughter that are both recipients of heart transplants, the impact of gun violence here in Birmingham, justice for reform, mental health in the Black community, Birmingham centenarians, and we even managed to squeeze in some content about the arts, fashion, and yoga. Each week we introduce entrepreneurs, business people, community activists, and others that would go unrecognized if not for the Birmingham Times. And when I read our editions each week, I realize that if not for the Birmingham Times, many of these stories would not be told. Our advertising support has increased as we hear from people all over the community telling us that they believe in our mission and they want to support what we do. In 2017, we ran a story about human trafficking in Birmingham. And after that story ran, several mainstream media outlets picked up on it and ran stories about the seriousness of the problem right here in Birmingham. And that is when it hit me that our premise, that we may not be able to carry some of these conversations to the broader community, but we can start the conversation, which is one of the goals that we had when we reimagined the Birmingham Times. It also confirmed that while the Times is not the biggest news organization, that we are doing some of the most important work that I've done in all my years in this business. We've updated our distribution strategy. You heard that we've had 225 plus locations around the community. We updated our website. We added an app. We've become a lot more aggressive on social media between Facebook and Twitter, Instagram. And all of those things are, the viewership is up hundreds of %. These things have all been a critical piece of us sort of evolving the Birmingham Times. And as I sit here in 2022 and think back over the last 5 or 6 years, and I think about the conversations that Barnett Wright and I had in late 2015 before we came over to the Birmingham Times. And we talked about what we were going to do and how we were going to execute on it. And we've had this conversation a time or two before. We're pretty much hitting it right where we thought we would go. And I think that we've been quite pleased with how the community has received the reimagined Birmingham Times and how people have welcomed us into their homes and into their businesses. And we look forward to the next 50 years of the Birmingham Times. Thank you so much. Now, I guess I'm supposed to open this up for questions and answers. Okay. Yes. Which we did. So basically, the revenue sources for newspapers are traditionally some of the traditional sources: advertising, circulation, and then our online, which is still advertising. In our case, we primarily rely on advertising. One of the things that we've seen is that newspapers have become challenged over and over across the country in terms of increasing circulation. So if we were a circulation-driven model, we would have a challenge doing that. What we do is we basically make the newspaper available in as many locations as we can around the city, so folks have an opportunity to pick it up and read it. And if you have picked our paper up, and by the way, I left copies out on the table for you. I left our Black History Month edition out there. I put about a couple bundles out there because I wanted you to kind of see. I thought it was a perfect edition to leave out here for today. But our paper generally is designed so that you can pick it up and read it in, I think, a relatively short period of time. And so from that perspective, we just want to get into people's hands so our advertisers will feel like they're getting value. And typically what we do is if you're running an ad with us on the newspaper, we add it to our digital footprint. That way we can expand the reach that you get to folks out there. But I don't. But now there are some newspapers, and you guys probably know this. It's funny. I used, as mentioned, I was the president of the Montgomery Advertiser, and I was going to buy a Montgomery Advertiser the other day. It's $5 on Sunday, and I was like, wow. It was $1.25 when I left. So there are a lot of folks who feel like circulation is a way for them to make up for some of the losses they're seeing as advertising has eroded. Hopefully I answered your question. Yes. Well, Barnett's here. You know, we have a very small staff. We stick and move. What we do is we actually have about 7 people on staff. A large portion of that is actually dedicated to content gathering, because that's really what we have. That's the goal that we have is making sure that content is there. Barnett has a couple of full-time reporters that work for him. He has a list of dozen stringers, Barnett, maybe 2 dozen. I don't know. Yeah, I was gonna say we have one here. We have one of us. So he has about a dozen stringers that he uses, and we use that as a way for us to supplement what we can do from a content standpoint. I will tell you that basically it's interesting. When I was at the Boston Globe, we made $500 million a year, and we lost money. We made $500 million a year, and we lost money. We owned everything. We owned the circulation. We owned the presses. We owned the trucks. We owned it. We don't own it here. We rent everything. And so when we don't have a demand for it, we don't pay for it. So our printing is done in Florence. We've got distribution contractors that distribute for us. We have to have a core staff because there's certain things that have to get done. But we hire stringers. We actually have contractors who actually sell advertising for us too. And so those are the things that we've tried to do in order to make sure that we're nimble and that we have the ability to reduce costs where we can. Yes, sir.
I assume you've been following Taylor versus New York Times trial.
Yeah.
As I have. There are those in our society who want to make it easy to sue the press, newspaper, for life. I disagree with that. I'd like to hear your opinion.
I'm with you. I think that I'll go back to the beginning of this conversation about the fourth estate. I think that we are not always going to like what we're told by media. And I'm not going to tell you that media gets it right all the time. In fact, the term media never existed before Richard Nixon. It was actually a sort of a strategy for Nixon to basically paint the media, which was newspapers and TV at the time, in a way to basically try to turn people against the media. And by the way, the trust of the media has been declining ever since. I think I saw a study that says that newspapers the media is trusted by 41% of the people, and that's actually kind of scary. But government's only trusted by 17% of the people. That's even scarier. So, but to your point, I think that it's written in the Constitution into the Constitution for a reason. And I think that we need to stick to the original premise that we need to have a free and untouched press in order to uncover things that make it better for the people. I saw another hand. Yes, sir. Yes.
One issue that faces the state is our failure to expand Medicaid. And I'd like to encourage you and your editor, and maybe you've already done this, but we need to talk about what it means to the state to expand Medicaid both to those 300,000 people who would otherwise have medical coverage, as much as the economic impact to the state for failure to expand, what it means to expand.
Sure.
So if you can add it to your list of things to begin to talk about, it will make a difference, a positive difference. I mean, you can say what is popular, but I think the job is also to make popular what needs to be said.
Yes.
And so I encourage y'all to take a look at Medicaid expansion and talk about it.
Well, we'll certainly take that under consideration. I think that we have talked about topics like that over the course of the last 5 or 6 years. We may not have talked about them in as great a detail as I think that maybe your suggestion, but I think that's sort of one of the topics that we know is an important aspect of this state. We've got people that are in need of healthcare that are being overlooked, and so we'll do that. Yes, Foster.
Thanks again for your comments. If you could look into your crystal ball, can you tell us what the newspaper industry looks like next 5, 10 years? I mean, I grew up looking at the newspaper. My mom's a librarian. Spending time reading the newspaper. People's focus is not there. I mean, they get their news from TikTok, Twitter, etc. By the time it gets to the newspaper, maybe it's all outside of the opinion pieces.
Yeah.
So, where do you see journalism and the role of newspapers?
Well, I think that I want to answer the first part of your question about where I see journalism. I am nervous about how people receive legitimate journalism because there's so much distraction on what is not. And there are so many people that are waiting for journalists or news providers or content providers. Let me just content providers to provide them with content that basically validates their way of thinking. And I think that is a scary thought when it comes to an unbiased media, because sometimes a newspaper or TV station, whatever, is going to tell you what you don't want to hear necessarily. But we hope it's the truth for you to form an opinion and deal with. But right now, I think that my concern is that we seem to feel that has less value. And as you have more proliferation of online news sites and the cable news channels continue to proliferate, I think it becomes even more concerning because people mistake what they're seeing as journalism. And the majority of those folks don't even have journalism degrees. They're just people that have a platform and they use that platform for public gain and people sort of buy into it. In terms of newspapers, one of the things that we thought about when we took over the Birmingham Times was to make it an online edition only. And that would have killed us. We would not exist today if we had done that. Because that space is just too difficult to play in. It's just too diluted. It's not localized enough in a way that allows you to generate numbers that allow you to sort of pay for what needs to get done, because all this got to get paid for. And so I do have concerns about that. Now, I mentioned earlier that there is this whole discussion about nonprofit journalism, and we saw that early on when we formed the Birmingham Times or the Birmingham Times Media Group, that we believe that that's going to be a part of the future discussion, and we really wanted to be positioned so that people have the ability to support journalism that they felt was valuable in a way that allowed it to maintain independence and to continue to be unbiased and speak to the truth in the communities. But long term, I've been doing this for 41 years. I don't think that I ever thought when I got in this business that there would not be enough runway to land the plane. But the older I get, the more concerned I am that we may be running out of runway to land the plane. And so I don't know. I like to think that there's still life in newspapers. I think a lot of folks still like to pick it up and read it and touch it and feel it. And we hear that a lot. I mean, and if you look at artists, again, I encourage, if you haven't read the Birmingham Times, I encourage you to read it. I encourage you to pick it up. I think it is just a great read. Now I'm biased, but it's digestible. You can, in a way that you can do it in short periods of time. it's just, I think it's a way for you to get news and information that you would not normally get if you didn't pick it up. And I think that is one of the concerns I have in general about people not reading newspapers, is that I know when I was a kid and I picked up the newspaper, I found out stuff that I needed to know that I didn't know I needed to know because I read it. And I don't think people do that today. I think people only, sometimes they find a way just to get the information that they think they need, and the other information that they need in order to make decisions, they pass right by it. Yes.
So much local reporting. It supports our perception of safety of low-relative communities. So the fact that you all have thrived, flourished without dwelling on lowest common denominator, sensational coverage, it's just a gift.
Well, thank you. Well, you know, the crime stories are empty calories. You know, they're easy to cover. I mean, they're easy to put out there, and you can get hits on them, whether or not. But they're not. It's not responsible journalism. One of the first discussions that I had with Barnett and my staff is that that's not what we're going to do. Not because we don't think it exists, but we'll let somebody else do that. I mean, there are other folks out there. It's not our responsibility to cover everything. I think that we have a responsibility, and our responsibility is to make sure that stories get told that wouldn't get told otherwise. And there's been an added plus for us. You know, I will admit, when we first began to talk about the Birmingham Times, this weekly newspaper of 10,000, it was not my initial thought that we would be as important, I think, in the discussion in this community as it relates to city and county government. But we are. We're the only people that I know of, and Barnett, you can correct me because I know you're down there, that send folks to the county meetings and the city meetings every week. Again, I could be wrong. Barnett, am I right or wrong? Okay, I just want to make sure I check my editor back here. Fact check me. And so that has actually created another expectation from folks in this community, where they realize that there are discussions going on at the city and county level that if it weren't for us covering, that they wouldn't know about. So I'm getting the hook. So, okay, good. Yes. Well, you could, so the good thing about us being about the Bronze Valley Foundation, which is our owner, you can donate. You know, we have had foundations that have donated to our foundation in order to support the work that we do. So clearly you have an opportunity to, if you believe in our journalism, you can support us that way, but you can also advertise with us. As I mentioned earlier, if you look at the pages of the Birmingham Times, we've got a lot of folks, different folks that are in there that are advertising things that are going on in the community. And we love to have you as a customer. So feel free to do that also as a way of supporting us. Thank you.